Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming to Threat Modeling, Concepts, and Actions. Your speaker is Chris Curry. Chris Curry is a cyber operations officer in the Delaware Air National Guard, specializing in cyber capability development, vulnerability research, and security assessments. His work with security assessments is coordinated with the Delaware Department of Technology and Information, where he joins a cadre of National Guard members and DTI security operations team to wargame the range of cyber threat scenarios scoped to protecting the state's critical infrastructure. Additionally, Chris works full-time for ICR Incorporated as a computer engineer and reverse engineer specializing in embedded and radio frequency systems. With ICR, he continues to serve as project lead and lead engineer on myriad projects, supporting technical research and perpetual capability development for the company's government customers. Prior to joining the Air Force and ICR, Chris served as an active duty officer in the Marine Corps, leading the operations element for Cyber Operations Unit at Fort Meade, Maryland. Before specializing in cyber operations, Chris was an AV-8B Harrier II attack pilot, supporting multinational and joint engagements while deployed on shipborne expeditionary tours. Prior to transitioning to the computer security world, Chris earned a graduate degree in computer science from the Whiting School of Engineering at Johns Hopkins University in his home state of Maryland.
Hi all, thank you for having me here. All right, I want to get started talking about threat modeling. I think it's very, very important. I don't believe that it's always done properly, but I also don't believe there's a proper way to do it. There are specific goals and outcomes that should occur because of this, and that should be our end state, to try and reach those goals. And we'll talk about a couple of ways to get there now. To start things off, I'm not very big on methodologies as well as frameworks. I think sometimes they can be limiting. So we're going to try and look at this at a framework agnostic approach. But we'll kick things off. Something also that I forgot that I put down in the bio prior to doing some of the more offensive computer stuff. I was flying airplanes, and I remember thinking that if only I could find a way to make a difference in any kind of stage. And I didn't think I was finding that flying, but I think working here, especially working here in Delaware with the members of DTI, I completely have a very rewarding experience. The sense of purpose there and the cadre who works there is amazing. So it is, it's funny, you think doing something as crazy as flying attack jets will make you feel really, really accomplished, like you're really doing something, but it doesn't. I think sometimes doing this computer security work could be the most effective actions we can do. Unless, of course, you're in an actual war, in which case attack planes are way more effective. But let's begin. So why do we do this? Because we don't want to get pwned. That's what it comes down to. Nobody wants to get hacked, and that's the end state. But how does threat modeling help out with that? It helps us minimize the risk, and helps us do that by understanding our attack surface from the eyes of an adversary. From their specific perspective, they'll be looking for things that most likely we aren't looking on for our own systems. By knowing our adversary's intent, their capabilities, their operational goals, their centers of gravity, we prevent ourselves from getting hacked by implementing security controls. Sorry about that. And how do we implement these security controls? How do you know how best to implement them? And how do you know where to implement them and at what level of granularity? Threat modeling will help uncover that. I am very certain that no matter how savvy our defenders are, it's a large enough organization, there's stuff out there that they may not know about, or that may not be hardened, that the attacker is probably looking at. But if you properly get ourselves into their mindset, then perhaps we can understand those vectors and properly harden them. Also, testing security controls. By properly threat modeling, it allows various opportunities to emulate that adversary, or to emulate the role of an attacker, which we'll go into the next slide. But that right there is going to test our security controls. But the most important thing, I think, is that this helps feed our intelligence lifecycle. And we'll go into that more. But that is a continuous cycle of collection, planning, processing, analyzing, and then reassessing. And that is a self-feeding tool that is going to be our most and our strongest ability to prevent against attacks. But before we start, let's talk about the different types of threat actors. This is a bit different than the common ones that we normally see. There's no insider threat here. Things have evolved, especially over the past 2 years. So we have our state-sponsored actor. What really characterizes them? They're low and slow. They sometimes may use 0 days. They do a lot of phishing. They probably don't want to get caught. They not only get caught, but they don't want to be discovered at all. They will sit there and slowly, bite by bite, exfil information in a manner in which we're probably not going to find them unless we are specifically looking for a common set of indications. And they're not always financially motivated. They could also be more or less forced to by some of the strongmen of their countries who kind of weigh heavily on them to continue and complete these actions prior to any harm coming to them or their loved ones. And that's real. They play the long game. They do. They're not going to probably pop up on your radars. You're probably not going to get a lot of noise about them, and they may not even trigger alarms. But they'll sit there and they'll wait for an opportunity to strike. And if they're in your system, they may not do anything. They might just sit there and wait, because that's what I would do. I would get in somebody's system and I would wait for the prime opportunity, and then when that time happens, then you execute and bug out. Let's talk about something else. Organized cyber criminals. They're pretty huge now, right? We see a lot of this in the news. Ransomware is huge. We just had a talk about that, a great talk. There's a lot of money there. There's a lack of barrier to entrance like there is in traditional organized crime. It's a lot easier to get to an organized crime hacking group than it would be to get into to be a mafioso perhaps. They are exploiting any kind of financial opportunity, stealing personally identifiable information, credit card numbers, social security numbers, dumping them, and then selling them on the dark web. There's plenty of markets there where you can buy card numbers or buy PII or social media accounts as well. And then hacktivists. So hacktivists kind of went away for a while, and then they came back with a vengeance over the past year or two. That's impressive. We all thought they were going to gone for good, but they're back. We see a lot of this right now, especially what was going on at the build-up to the war in Ukraine, and then kind of going into that. But then again, sometimes things draw down, which kind of goes back to my previous point, is when you're in an actual war, your computers are probably less of a priority than your life. So a lot of this has kind of died down, but then we see in other portions of the world that are around and adjacent to some war zones, there's a lot of hacktivism going on. Different types of attacks too. We're going to see a lot of some malware. Maybe it's not homegrown, maybe they don't brew their own, but lots of DDoS attacks, lots of botnets. I think, there's a time when anonymous was only a couple people and then about 1,000 people who thought they were really anonymous, but they weren't, and they were just, they were botnets. They were just using up their IP space to perform DDoS attacks. Perform a lot of doxing too. And then web page defacement, social media defacement, disinformation. Then, talk about the lone wolf. This isn't normally talked about as much as a type of threat actor, but it's definitely a very, very dangerous one. You'll see a lot of lone wolves working in the dark web by themselves, not really working with any other individuals. They are completely autonomous. They probably have a heightened sense of operational security as well, and fear of getting caught. And you'll see these individuals performing a lot of services. So cybercrime as a service, ransomware as a service, hacking as a service. You get the point. They market themselves as single individuals who will accomplish X, Y, and Z goal for a cost. And there's a couple very, very capable lone wolf hackers that exist out there that are doing quite all right for themselves right now just by providing their services. So when we think about the different types of threat actor, how does that come into our threat modeling? Well, we want to understand the intent and the notion that they will have going into their own attack scenarios, their goals, and how that aligns with our kind of organization. If we are an ice cream shop, a mom and pop shop, probably not going to be a target for a state-sponsored actor, but we might. We might, just depending on who's there, but I wouldn't bet on it. If we're worried about our finances getting hacked, then I'd say, probably all but the hacktivists are going to be, we would worry about them. And if we are a government entity that has some very polarizing actions and issues that they support, we could find ourselves a victim of hacktivists. But right before we start this threat modeling exercise, let's dispel a couple notions. The first one there is that we have the answers to criticality in our enterprise. What does this mean? This means off the bat, we believe that we know what are the most critical elements in our enterprise. It's kind of hard to accomplish without some serious analytical work. And I'm not going to get into the steps of these, but this is kind of where business continuity and disaster recovery come into play. Most importantly, because they'll force us to complete our BIAs up there, which is our business impact analysis, and those are essential. That tells us, okay, at X, Y, and Z time, if this happens, this is going to have X, Y, and Z effect on the organization. It's the commercial impact of the enterprise's assets, resources, business and processes that can be effective due to any kind of disruption. And these kind of exercises where you do this with your team, you want to get stakeholders from every leadership role and every functional role in your organization. And then you sit down and you scope it out, because not one entity is going to have the answers. But when working together as a team, we might be able to find out, okay, these are the critical nodes that, if attacked, will cause the greatest business impact. I want to focus on that. But I am not going to prescribe a specific business continuity and disaster recovery plan as long as one is complete with vested and very involved individuals. You want individuals who are in the weeds with business processes. Another thing is that we are not unique. As individuals, we all here are unique, but from an organizational perspective, our logical landscape is not unique to the eyes of an experienced attacker. Everything in front of that perimeter that gets into our internal network, it's just an amalgamation of computational processes that are unoriginal. Everything's kind of a repeat of something else with some added flavors into it. And we start breaking down our logical layer and our logical environment down to its component parts, into its systems. You see the same things over and over and over again. No one's unique. from a computer security perspective, but from individuals, we're all unique. And next, we're asking the wrong questions. We're going to go into this in the next slide. And by questions, I mean our priority intelligence requirements. This is it's a term that's probably not always used properly. It's probably not always used as it should be. Your priority intelligence requirements, these are, it's a term that kind of came up in the military. In the military, they would define that as, yes or no questions that are specific to and to one specific topic that a commander would want to know, immediately. That's going to result in a decision to be made. A bit different for non-military businesses, but it's not. Because if we're an organization right now and we have computers and we are a public in any kind of way, we are under threat of an attack. So they must support our business's strategic goals, matching the dynamic pace of cyber threat landscape to the new threats that are discovered every day. And last there, I don't think anyone in this room needs to be reminded of this, but it's something that should always be brought up, and at least we should be aware that not all individuals understand that protecting ourselves from cyber attacks is a technical challenge, because it's not a technical challenge. It is, but there's so much more that goes into it. There's employee training, there's customer end user agreements that play into this. It's identifying and hardening critical assets by technical and non-technical means. Training our individuals from social engineering attacks. It's not all technical. So let's talk about priority intelligence requirements. They want to answer they want to begin by answering the who, what, when, where, and why. Most importantly, how are particular critical questions that we may have can affect our overall business processes, and how a piece of information that can be collected, can be analyzed, and will help answer yes or no, this is going to result in a decision that has to be made to protect our enterprise. It's very specific, and it has to be narrowed down to a specific topic, and it has to sometimes be answered in a yes or no question or a quantifiable question. It's not so much open-ended. There's definite and empirical answer that should be applied to it. For example, there was the example up there, but another one would be what threats have been active exploiting financial systems. It's kind of generic, but what about what criminal groups in the last 6 months have been actively targeting Magneto and the European Union? It's specific. You have a time period there. It answers a question that it provides a question that can be answered by an empirical response, and it will most likely result in a business decision that have to be made. So we'll talk about building our threat model here. We have kind of the system up on the screen up here, and I said I don't want to talk about frameworks. This kind of looks like one, but think of it as kind of more intuitive understanding that needs to be made in no particular order, because this entire thing is a cycle. But these are the pieces of information that need to be studied and understand fully in order to build a threat model. So we understand our threat source. And our threat source not only identifies the source from who they are, but also understands and includes their capability, their intent, their targeting characteristics for any kind of adversarial threats in the range of effects for non-adversarial threats. So what does that mean? It means understanding anything that willing or unwilling, will do harm to our organization. How it will do that, why that would happen, and what is the recent, how timely is information that we have about our current threat source. And then next, from that threat source, they'll create a threat event, which is just a scenario that can occur that may cause damage or harm to organization. So we want to scope that. We want to gather as much information as we can about the threat source, about the way that they can affect current processes in our critical and vulnerable nodes. We want to understand how they do it, by which manner of method they achieve their initial access. We want to, most importantly, demarcate our perimeter boundary. What this means is understanding where our landscape ends, or where we choose to have our landscape end. Sometimes this is very, very difficult, especially when we are working with multiple third parties who hold vested interests in our own equities and who may be hosting some of our equities. This is challenging here because if we are outsourcing some of our processes, who owns the overwatch and the sensors, and who has the responsibilities to report, protect, and harden those mutually desired assets that we might not have complete control over. And many of these will go into, these are more of contractual questions, something we should ensure that we think about whenever you work with some kind of third party. But nevertheless, for the purposes of understanding what our landscape looks like and the susceptibility to vulnerabilities, we want to have that defined. And the next, system decomposition. This is something that not everyone will be able to do for every location and every spot and every critical node. Our system decomposition is what we talked about before. It's taking down these assets, breaking them down to their component parts, and then drawing a diagram, which sometimes helps out a lot. And we'll have one later on. A data flow diagram, perhaps, a processes flow diagram, with also labeled and understanding who has access to this data flow, and at what point at each flow or node along the data flow diagram can an external user or a failure in X, Y, and Z system cause the most business impact. And then divide trust boundaries. We kind of talked about that. So that's what I mean by trust boundaries. It's at what level along our component parts are the trusted members able to access that, and to what extent? And ensuring with our security controls and other technical restraints we can put on things, ensuring that only those with the amount of trust required can have access to those nodes. And the next, threat identification. So we know what kind of actors want to attack us now. We have an idea of what their intents may be. We have received some intelligence that say, hey, this organization here may be targeting you because this aligns with their latest campaigns that we've received reports of in the past 3 or 4 months, however. Identifying that, then narrowing down, okay, well, this might be, APT 0, this could be APT 25, and this could be, APT 28, whatever you want to call it. The names don't matter as long as you understand what their capabilities are, what their intent is, and what their methods and procedures are, as much as you can, because you can never really know all of it. And the next, attack modeling. Now that we have identified who these threat actors are, we identified who they most likely will be, we have identified and understood as much as we can what their capabilities are, and we have a rough estimate on the why and what their intended impact on us are. We could start mapping out a sequence of attacks that we think they might try and execute. And there's many different ways to do this. I have one example coming up, but it doesn't really matter how you go ahead by mapping out their attack chain, as long as the proper research beforehand was doing it and the end state is still the same. It uncovers those critical nodes that might need additional hardening or might identify other weak points or other unknown attack vectors that we might have sitting out there in the public. I'm going to describe their TTPs, and we're going to map them against our current assets. And again, this can be helped with the aid of frameworks. And then we take that framework and we build upon that, and we start being creative and not limiting ourselves to what populates when we type in APT 33. We're going to look at that, understand it, and think, okay, that's good, but this is based off of information that came out in 2012. It's not that relevant now, but understanding their rough capability and knowing their intent can help us provide some imagination to that attack chain that was given to us for this threat actor. Because if you look, a lot of the reports that some of these frameworks have, and they build upon their kill chain descriptions for X, Y, and Z threat actor. A lot of them are kind of outdated, and sometimes they only result in ensuring that you have patched Y or X or Z vulnerability, which is good, but you should be patching all your stuff if you can. You shouldn't wait for a model to tell you to patch something that's available. But if I read a report saying, okay, this threat actor group has been attacking VPN services, and it looks like they were using let's say like a Pulse Secure vulnerability, and they're actively exploiting it. Awesome, we patched it, great. We haven't heard from them in 3 years, awesome. But we have our own VPN services hanging out there that may be misconfigured. They might be exploiting it. And you might want to have some security controls there. Just because it hasn't been seen before in the past doesn't mean it doesn't exist and the threat isn't real. So that's why understanding how they go about attacking is a bit more important and a bit more enriching than understanding what specifically they did in the past. Because if they did in the past and it's on the news, they'd be pretty silly to try and do that again. If I made an exploit for an organization and they were using it, and then I saw in the news it was caught, I can guarantee you not a single individual would use that same thing again. It's just going to flag you, get you caught. So they're probably actively looking for other ways to get in. So that's why understanding the overall methods is important, which I hope none of us here are just stopping at ensuring our CVEs are patched. We have to do a bit more work than that. And then last, that kind of goes into generating threat scenarios. So let's say there's an attacker out there, it's APT 55, and I'm just making up this number, but they've been actively seen in the past, reporting has indicated that they were exploiting a link for a contact link in Microsoft Office, in Microsoft Outlook. Great, we got that patched, awesome, everybody high five, we're gonna get beers now, we're done, we're leaving, because we got that one vulnerability patched. That's great, but that's how you get hacked and you don't notice it. Well, everyone's high-fiving, throwing one back for patching up everything, they're getting their data exfilled. So that's also generating a threat scenario also means, hey, what are other methods of macroless execution that could be exploited by an external user or perhaps an internal user as well that we haven't thought about? And that's kind of doing your research, understanding your products, or having those individuals with the right mindset to understand that specific product or that specific piece of technology that our organization is using, and dissecting it and understanding, okay, cool, yeah, well, they're doing this via a macroless command execution, like something called DDE Auto, which was kind of big a couple years ago until Microsoft made it no longer activated by default. And this was a method of macroless command execution. So awesome, we changed our registry and we got that whole thing fixed and we're good. No, let's understand all the capabilities and all the methods that Microsoft Office could have, and have the proper individuals there looking at that to ensure, okay, is there another way they could be exploiting this? Could they be shifting left and right? Because if they're a professional hacker and they get burned and caught like that, they would be out of their mind to try and use the same technique over again. While I'm not saying once something hits the news, it's too late, it's not, because once something hits the news, a factor of 30 different copycats are going to be exploding in the wild, and you're going to see it blow up. So, of course, that stuff should get patched immediately, but don't stop there. And that, one of the big things that go into our threat model, we kind of talked about everything else here, and that kind of leads to vulnerability. And we kind of talked about vulnerabilities. There's not so much vulnerabilities in our products and our application, our technologies, but also vulnerabilities in our business processes. It's vulnerabilities, it could be a lack of identification and lack of confirmation when delivering products, when receiving pieces of hardware that we need to incorporate into our current systems. It could be individuals who are notoriously bad about keeping their computers up to date while they try and VPN into our into the internal network. Well, that's awesome. I can now VPN into my organizational network. I can VPN to my work computer. This is great. And I'm just going to keep on hitting ignore whenever the security updates pop up, like my kids do, which is awful. I'm going to keep on doing that. And the next thing you know, I might have gotten exploited and someone just RDP'd into my computer and now they have access to our internal network. That's now it's kind of just rambling with that, but isn't that how the Okta hack was a lot like that? It was an individual who was pwned on their computer as they were RDPing into the internal network. So, I mean, it happens. So vulnerabilities aren't just pieces of technology. They could be an individual whose behavior could be vulnerable to our logical infrastructure. So now that we think about, okay, we've identified a couple methods that can be exploited. We identify what the threat actor is probably going to want to do, what they're going to be looking at. We now know we kind of have a good gauge of how we can be attacked, but now we got to think about, hey, what's the business impact of this? How much damage can they actually do? And then what's the likelihood of that happening? And then that takes us into our risk and controls, because the impact, times the likelihood is our risk. I think I heard that earlier today. And it's true. If there is a 100% chance of a cross-site scripting vulnerability on this website that's a complete static page, it doesn't talk to anything in the back end, it's not even really it's not really running a web app per se, it's just an information portal, and there is a cross-site scripting vulnerability in it that is not stored and it's reflected, meaning only the person who's executing it will be able to see the results. It might have a 100% chance of occurring, but what's the impact of that? If it's not exploitable, then note it, pass along, and look at something that has a bigger impact. You don't even really consider that. That is not considered a risk. Why? Because the likelihood might be 100, but the impact's 0. So 100 times 0 is 0. There's no risk there. But then there are other issues too. Let's say a truck carrying laptops we're purchasing gets carjacked, and people go ahead and place a bunch of malware. They embed into the firmware of our systems, and we have no idea how to even detect that, because it's down at a driver level. They use stolen certificates, and they are using stolen certificates that have not yet been exploited. So it's probably not going to flag, but that's a huge impact. What's the likelihood of that happening? I don't know anyone who's had their truck carjacked. So probably low likelihood, a lot of impact. So there's a little median area there, and that's what we want to think about. All right, we have individuals who VPN and remote work quite often, and our threat actors are known for sending a lot of phishing attempts. Okay, what's the likelihood of that happening? It's probably pretty high. What's the likelihood of the person clicking the link? May not be as high, but what impact could it have? It could have pretty significant impact. I would pay $1,000 that there isn't a person in this room that hasn't received a terrible phishing attempt. So it happens a lot. But so we think about all those, and then we kind of implement our security controls. And what's that going to be? What's that going to look like? It's going to it's like ensuring that any computer that is going to VPN or remote into the internal network has to be subscribed to the current device plan, to the device management plan of the organization. All right, there is one right there. Or we could have timeouts or lockouts of X minutes after logging on for any kind of RDP connection, and then force the user to log back in using multi-factor authentication. And that's another one. And then we think about, okay, now that we have implemented these, what's the residual risk after that? Is there any? There probably is some. So we will try and refine those controls. And all around the same time, we're going to be thinking about different and new and novel attack opportunities that could happen, and then we'll continue feeding our cycle. So threat modeling, in this case, would just be that second bullet up there. But as we can see, it's the basis of the rest of our risk architecture. And without proper threat modeling, we're not going to know to any degree of certainty that a stakeholder would feel confident about, or should feel confident about, if proper modeling isn't complete. And when I say proper modeling, I mean threat modeling to the granularity that is required to understand, really to get to part 4 right there, attack modeling. Map the sequence of the attack, describe the TTPs, generate attack scenarios, and that is going to feed the rest of our risk model up here. So that's what we want, and that'll stop us from it will lessen the likelihood of us getting pwned. But there's nothing anyone can do to completely eliminate that risk. It's like, they have those jokes that, like the chances of getting ran over in a rickshaw by Chuck Norris is unlikely, but it's not zero. So the risk always remains, and we want to just ensure that we're minimizing that as much as possible, but you'll never, ever eliminate all the risks. So now we talk about a modified intelligence lifecycle. So this has changed up a bit. Most intelligence cycles that we see in relation to cyber threat intelligence is a cut and copy of the intelligence cycle that intelligence agencies and the military use. And that's an amazing place to start from. But it's a bit different. And it's different when we work in public organizations when our end state is successful business operation and protection, not so much to win wars. So this is a bit modified, but the first thing we want to do, and I'm saying first because this is eventually going to be a cycle. This is a cycle, and all feeds into each other. But if we're just starting this right now, we want to establish the PIRs, the priority intelligence requirements that are going to answer those specific and key questions that decision makers need to know that will result in a business decision. So we have those. Now we have to evaluate our sources. And by sources, I mean our sources of collection. This can be threat intel feeds. It could be our sensors we've in place. It could be logs. It could be our CrowdStrike logs. It could be our Red Shield logs. It could be router logs. It could be outsourcing pieces of our infrastructure to third parties to monitor. And I was saying any one is better than the other, but each should be evaluated for its particular use case in our organization. And then we thought, okay, I have a tap built in to some critical nodes there. I'm mirroring all of our traffic. I have an intrusion prevention system, and I have my alert set up, and my Splunk dashboard ready. And then we're subscribing to company Apple's, or I guess it's an actual company name, Company Banana's threat feed. All right, so let's build our plan. That's our plan. And then each one of those sources are going to attempt to answer those PIRs. Because we did our due diligence, the PIRs are going to be the questions that are going to answer decision or result in decisions that are going to have the biggest impact on organizational goals. So everything has to feed back to those. And then next, collect and process. Collecting, obvious what that means. Processing just means taking that raw data and turning it into usable information that can be analyzed. And then that processed information is analyzed. And we'll say, hey, let's look at this. Is this effective? What are we getting here? All right, we're just getting nothing but noise. We're getting nothing but noise. We're getting nothing but internal traffic. It's blowing up our logs. This isn't that good. But hey, what is this? Why is our copy den making outbound and reverse SSH connections to some DigitalOcean instance? That's weird. What's going on there? And then we'll further analyze it, and then that'll then in turn allow us to update our PIRs, and then we're going to continue that. And again, what is feeding this? Which threat modeling, it's the most important step and the most important reason why we conduct this, as stated in the second slide, is to feed this. And this will help keep us secure and at least protected somewhat against threats, or most likely threats. So we're going to enrich it with some threat intelligence. Now, I'm not going to talk exactly about specific threat intelligence processes because it's wide and it's going to be whatever works best for your organization. But this is going to be your basis for your collection plans. So we have our telemetry. Telemetry just means those sensors that are picking up technical data that by itself may not mean much, but is associated with bigger processes. If we can't get on the darknet, individuals can, and that's something that could possibly be outsourced in an organization to do darknet sweeps. If you have some kind of notification, like password, a lot of password managers do that. They'll let you know if one of your credentials or emails show up on the dark net. Honeypots are pretty great. I've actually, I think properly implemented, they could be a great thing. It sounds amazing in theory. I've never seen one that's truly amazing as what they could be. Tailored feeds, what I mean by tailored feeds is those intelligence feeds that are specific to your use case and can answer a priority intelligence requirement. Because if it doesn't, and it's not going to result in business decisions, it's not going to result in uncovering future threats, then it's just noise. And it's more noise to sift through, and that's additional work that just does not need to be accomplished. It needs to be executed. I can't spend, or if I'm being an attacker, I'll be more than happy to flood somebody's logs with junk data as I slowly get in and exfil stuff. And then once I'm gone, then you stop the noise, and everyone's just analyzing the noise and then realize that their user accounts got hacked and dumped. And then utilize non-technical intelligence. So understanding geopolitical trends in areas where attacks may be launched. And also, just a pause, if anyone has any questions, anything to add, please do, and feel free to interrupt me with it. So utilize non-technical intelligence. So what do I mean by that? It's geopolitical trends in areas where attacks may be launched, but not just so much where attacks can be launched, but where we may have assets and vested interest. Geopolitical risk includes disruptions that occur throughout the world. COVID was a humongous risk and a humongous event that I've seen personally result in a lot of cybercrime that occurs. Supply chains, pandemics, transportation networks, any of these assets that exist in other parts of the world that may have an impact on your business, or you may have some kind of vested interest in, can all hurt you. So understanding geopolitical threats can be a big help. And then determining what networks may require further hardening. All right, I gotta introduce some load balancing so I don't get hit with a DDoS attack again. So we're gonna apply these concepts real quickly with a made-up bank called the East Northeast Wilmington Bank. It's not real, but we'll do some threat modeling for them. So let's think about the business impacts for a financial institution. Theft, obviously. Operational costs, yep. Fines, what are fines? Fines are from regulatory bodies when they're found to be not participating or conducting an action in which they are deemed to perform. Reputational damage, which is obviously the biggest risk and the biggest impact. And contractual, that includes contracts between two different partner organizations that may actually be violated. An example of this could be like the, any standing or agreement that's signed in legal between two organizations can actually result in negative and harm if it's found after an attack that those have been violated. All right, so we talked about what's the big impact for us. Let's frame it. What do you think is the worst? So we have our likelihood and our severity. Kind of like we saw before, our likelihood and our impact. So any one of these things will result in the biggest impact, which will be a reputational damage. Which one could have the most? We think corruption or destruction of our information systems probably could. Data leakage could too. Again, look at the bottom, supply chain disruption. Completely severe, but not very likely. So now we're gonna do attack surface analysis. Now it's kind of hard to see what's going on up here, but as you can see, we have a bank, we have our internal application system, we have our ATM server, and a VLAN router, which will allow individuals to, which segments the internal network. We have multiple remote employees connecting through VPN gateways to get to the application server. And then you have your user down there at the bottom who is using the web app. And the end state for the attacker, we believe, is to get to right there in the bottom right, the central bank, and get into the banking network. So we think about that, and then we draw what we kind of have here is like a data flow diagram. So let's build it. So we talked about the threats that can occur here. We know we're going to start by getting our information. We're going to learn about our own systems and our adversaries. we have decomposed our systems here for the threat identification. We've been tipped off, in the next slide that will come up, that there is an APT that has been bragging about targeting banks, financial institutions in Delaware. We saw it on the dark web. So we start gathering some more information about that, and then we do some attack modeling. So let's get into that. So our adversarial analysis. This is APT 25, who I think has the coolest other names. So it's kind of hard to see here because we have a panda there, but their other names are Vixen Panda, Kachang, Sushi Rolls under there, which I think are just great names. That's any one of them I would take. Then you have, that's their unofficial logo, Vixen Panda on the top right. So we learned on the dark web that they've been attacking critical infrastructure in the Mid-Atlantic, and knowing that financial institutions are considered that, as well as the dealings of the East Northeast Wilmington Bank has with transportation systems, communication systems, and critical manufacturing sectors, we have a good idea that they're probably going to be targeted. And then, and this is true, historical reporting indicates that they have been exploiting vulnerabilities in Pulse Secure VPN, which the bank utilizes. So, and last, they've been using a lot of phishing attacks and then probing remote access endpoints to gain initial access to the network. So here is one example of adversarial analysis. So you see from the top, this is all taken from recent reporting. You have your initial access, your gateway, and methods to perform, methods for persistence, lateral movement what's inside the network, how they expand access, and command and control. Now these are actual TTPs for Vixen Panda, but their specifics aren't really, that's not the subject of this right now. It's just understanding that we have a plan to lay out their attack chain. And then we're going to use that and layer it on top of our current attack surface analysis. So we have those 3 Kachang operators off to the left, and we have suspected and we have planned out that they're probably going to be attacking these remote access points. They're going to be phishing users, they're going to be phishing bank employees, and they'll be attacking the VPN gateways and the web app. Now, knowing that they conduct a lot of theft, data theft, and perhaps destroying the internals of a piece of critical infrastructure, we've assessed they're probably going to use one of these gateways to try and get into our application server, which is most likely some enterprise application. And if anyone here has tested a lot of enterprise applications, a lot of times if they're made for a single customer, they don't undergo a lot of the rigorous testing that more public products do. So if it is vulnerable and they are capable of exploiting it, they could potentially get to the server that connects them to the banking network and perhaps the central bank. So we're going to put this into action. We're going to take what we have in our model and we're going to think about security mitigations. What security mitigation can we in place at the different critical nodes to stop them from reaching their goal of getting to the application server in our internal network via the methods that they have traditionally used in the past? These are examples of them. For example, drop all traffic and IPs known to belong or associated with APT25 or their partners. Evaluate all the communication channels that exist. We're going to employ our threat hunters to really get in and take a better look at our VPN logs, enterprise server logs, at our WAF logs, and also the internals to our VLAN router, which will connect all the internal nodes together. While we don't have unlimited threat hunters, this can allow us to scope our limited resources into those critical nodes. And adversarial emulation, if we are lucky enough to have a capable red team or a team that we can employ, we want them to, yes, use the techniques and the TTPs that have been seen in recent reporting, but you also need one that can be creative and go after, okay, like we talked about before, this VPN service is up and running, people can log into it, awesome, it's patched. So you should have those individuals, see how well it's patched and how well it's configured. And also, they can be performing vulnerability assessments and security assessments against that internal application server. So you can see, all right, if someone was to get in, if someone was to get phished or pwned, and now they have an RDP session open on their personal computer they're using to remote into the internal network, let's start looking at some of those logs and seeing what's going on. And then also, hit them up hard. Hit up those gateways, pretty aggressively. And then architecture, we think about how we're going to employ and revamp our current architectural system in such a case that we're not vulnerable to one of those specific attacks that they're known for. And if we were, the impact is going to be minimized. And that's probably a better way to find success, ensuring that if you were to get exploited, as they've been in the past, then threat will be minimized. And then this all goes back to our intelligence lifecycle. Feeds our PIRs, feeds our sources, data is collected, and it will continue to enrich and allow us to employ our red teams better, our threat hunters better, and our security controls and mitigations. And that's where it ends. But it's a cycle, so it continues. If anyone has any questions or wants to talk about this more, I'll be around.
Thank you very much. Let's show our appreciation. Please provide your surveys at the door.